Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr. Speaker, an interesting contribution from the member in charge of what is work. The member whose job it is to wander out around the country and ask the world, what is work? What is it about? What's a job? What's a job going to be? These are the questions that Grant Robertson is asking himself as he travels his whimsical way around the country, working on a statement of the bleedingly obvious, Mr. Speaker. Working on a statement of the bleedingly obvious. Although you have to say, it's not all Grant's own work, because there are shades of David Parker in that speech, it's fair to say. And before that, even I heard hints of David Cunliffe. Hints of David Cunliffe, Mr. Speaker, which just goes to show you can change the finance spokesperson in the Labor Party, but the dribble remains the same, Mr. Speaker. The dribble continues. Actually, Mr. Speaker, I do believe you can change the leader of the Labor Party and the words don't change. That's the weird thing, Mr. Speaker, because we had some State of the Nation address from the new Labor leader, that chap Mr. Little, at the beginning of the year, and I thought to myself, as one of the 10 listeners to that speech, I thought to myself, some of that sounds a bit like something I might have heard before, Mr. Speaker. So let's have a look at some of the lines from the speech of Mr. Little, Mr. Speaker. For example, we need a bold new approach to creating jobs and increasing incomes. That sounds like Mr. Little, doesn't it? Creating jobs. Well, actually, it was Phil Goff. Phil Goff in May 2010, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Little said the Labor Party I lead is about jobs. Good jobs, skilled jobs, well-paid jobs, Mr. Speaker. So that's good. Cunliffe, of course, his was slightly different. He said, a job is more than a weekly wage. It gives people a purpose and pride in themselves. That's why I'm focusing on jobs. That was Mr. No, it wasn't Mr. Cunliffe. It was Mr. Shearer, Mr. Speaker. It was Mr. Shearer. Mr. Speaker, since Labor has been in opposition, they have talked like nothing else about creating jobs, and the only job they've created, Mr. Speaker, is a job for Grant Robertson to find out what a job is, Mr. Speaker. That's the only... But it's not just jobs. They're big on small business these days. They've suddenly discovered small business, Mr. Speaker. Small party, small business. Mr. Little said, small business success is a priority for Labor. That's what Mr. No, it wasn't. It was Mr. Cunliffe. What Mr. Little said is Labor will now make small business a priority, Mr. Speaker. So on and so on. And of course, the trouble with their newfound focus on small business, Mr. Speaker, is that actually they don't have any interest in promoting small business at all, because Mr. Little wanders out there and says, oh, I'm very interested in small business, but what they want to do is about what they want to do to small business rather than what they'll do for small business, Mr. Speaker. So he says, I want to go out and help small business, but, oh, by the way, I want to drop the 90-day trial for new employees.
That's right.
That's still off. Dropping the starting out wage, that's still a problem. Still a massive big increase in the minimum wage. He hasn't ruled out the KiwiSaver contribution increases, the comprehensive capital gains tax, still talking about that, sitting on a fence. It's getting uncomfortable, the pails in his backside. A much more expensive ETS, tough new taxes on water use, and of course the National Pay Award system was actually designed by Mr. Little. And of course, so he's out there, as Mr. Cunliffe before him, saying, I love small business, putting his arms around small business and choking them to death, Mr. Speaker. That's the plan of the Labor Party, Mr. Speaker, for small business. So nothing's changed. Nothing has changed at all. We have a new megaphone, but the same language, Mr. Speaker, just like we had the last time and just like we had the time before that. And weirdly, the time before that and the time before that. And weirdly, an election was only 3 months ago, and just imagine how weird it is to members on this side to get up and hear a speech from Grant Robertson today that was virtually identical to one by David Parker 3 months before the election, and identical to another one by David Cunliffe a couple of years before that, Mr. Speaker. This government is focused on creating jobs for New Zealanders. And unlike the opposition who are trying to still work out what a job is, Mr. Speaker, we are out there encouraging investment that creates jobs. 28,000 jobs in the last quarter, Mr. Speaker, 80,000 in the last year, 146,000 in the last 2 years, Mr. Speaker, and that is the strongest job growth in 2 years in a decade. And yet the Labor leader puts out a press release last week saying that there is a jobless recovery in this country, Mr. Speaker. A jobless recovery. Well, if that's a jobless recovery, then he really does not know what he's talking about, Mr. Speaker. 146,000 additional new jobs in the New Zealand economy over the last 2 years. That's what this government is focused on, not yakking on about what's at work and who needs workers really, and do workers need organisations more than organisations need workers. That was one of Grant's theories the other day. Yep, they're all very exciting stuff. All theory, all a million miles from what is reality. Meanwhile, this government getting on with the job, doing the things that encourage people to invest in the New Zealand economy, hire more people and grow more jobs. That's what's going on with this government, Mr. Speaker, and the opposition on the other side is pretending all that isn't happening. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Very good.